2 days from now, the United States turns 250 years old, and 3 separate disasters are timed to arrive at the same party. A record heat dome is cooking the eastern half of the country toward all-time highs. A storm launched by the sun is crossing 93 million miles of space, forecast to strike on the night of the 4th, and along the edge of that same heat, violent thunderstorms are exploding across the middle of the country. Almost none of the millions of people about to gather under that sky have any idea how much is stacked above their heads, or that 2 of these 3 things are aiming at the very same fragile machine the whole celebration depends on. If you want the full picture before the fireworks, hit that like button and subscribe to the Sky Lab, where we connect the dots no one else is connecting. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether this heat has reached you yet. Now, let's get into it. 2. Part 1. The Weekend. Everything arrives at once. 2 days from now, the United States turns 250 years old, and almost nobody watching the fireworks will understand what else is arriving on that exact same night. We tend to think of the 4th of July as a fixed thing, a date that behaves itself, a warm evening with a barbecue and a flag and a sky full of colour. This year the sky has other plans. This year, 3 completely separate systems that have nothing in common except timing, are converging on the same 48 hours, and 2 of them are aiming at the same fragile piece of machinery that the whole celebration quietly depends on. Let me tell you what is already in motion, because none of this is a forecast in the nervous might happen sense. It is happening now, and the data behind it is not subtle. The first system is a heat dome, and it is not an ordinary one. A powerful ridge of high pressure has locked itself over the eastern half of the country, and underneath it the air is being compressed and cooked until the numbers stop looking like weather and start looking like warnings. As of this morning, the National Weather Service had 256 active alerts posted across the country. Of those, 59 were extreme heat warnings, the most serious heat product the agency issues. Another 55 were heat advisories, 4 more were extreme heat watches. Add those together and you get well over 100 separate heat alerts stacked across the map on a single day, and the peak of that heat lands squarely on the holiday. The second system is 93 million miles away, and it has nothing to do with the weather at all. On the surface of the sun, 2 dark regions have twisted themselves into the most dangerous magnetic configuration our star can produce, and one of them has already fired. A cloud of charged particles is crossing the space between the sun and the Earth right now, and the government's own Space Weather Prediction Center has issued a geomagnetic storm watch for July 3rd and July 4th. The forecasters expect the storm to arrive, in their words, on the night of the 4th. They are telling people that the Aurora, the northern lights, could be pushed as far south as New York. The third system is the one that looks the most familiar, and is, in its own way, the most violent. Along the northern and western edge of that same heat dome, the atmosphere is being pried open. The Storm Prediction Center has drawn an enhanced risk for severe thunderstorms across the upper Midwest, with the machinery in place for very large hail, wind gusts that can flip a trailer, and in one outlook the blunt admission that a tornado cannot be ruled out. The same ridge that is baking the east is manufacturing the storms that will hammer the middle of the country. Now here is the part that matters, the reason I am not simply reading you 3 separate headlines and moving on. These 3 systems are not really 3 stories, they are one story wearing 3 costumes, and the thread that ties them together runs straight through the thing you will be relying on to keep the lights on, the air conditioner running, and the fireworks broadcast alive. That thread is the electrical grid. Think about what a record heatwave does to a grid. It drives demand to the ceiling. Tens of millions of air conditioners switch on at once and stay on through the night, and the network that carries that power runs hotter and closer to its limit than at almost any other time of the year. Now think about what a geomagnetic storm does to a grid. It induces stray electrical currents in exactly the kind of long transmission lines that carry that power, currents the system was never designed to want. On most days, those 2 facts would live in completely different conversations. On the night of the 4th of July, 2026, they're going to be happening at the same time to the same wires, over the same country, on the single biggest outdoor holiday of the year. I want to be careful here, because being careful is the whole point of this channel. The geomagnetic storm that is coming is a moderate one, not a monster. The heat wave, as dangerous as it is survivable for most people with power and water. I am not here to tell you the grid is going to fail on Saturday night. What I am here to tell you is that we're about to run a stress test, an accidental one, a national one, and it is going to reveal something about how many separate systems a modern country is quietly holding in its hands at any given moment, and how thin some of the margins between them really are. And there is more converging than just those three. While the dome bakes and the storm approaches and the thunderheads build, a mountain of rock roughly 1/4 of a mile to half a mile across is going to slide past the Earth on the 4th itself. A safe miss, but a real object, catalogued and tracked, threading by on the exact day. Underneath all of it, the ground has been unusually busy, with more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater in the past week alone, including a magnitude 6 event off the coast of Japan. And beneath even that, slowly, the Pacific Ocean is warming again, tipping the long odds of the seasons toward a future where weekends like this one stop being rare coincidences and start becoming the pattern. That is a lot to hold in your head at once, and holding it all at once is exactly what this video is about. Because the strangest thing about this weekend is not any single one of these events. Every one of them, taken alone, is something this country has seen before. A heat wave is not new, a solar storm is not new, a severe weather outbreak is not new, an asteroid passing at a safe distance is, frankly, routine. What is not routine, what genuinely stops you when you lay it all out on the table, is the timing. It is the fact that all of it is landing in the same window, on the same date, on the birthday, and that so few people seem to have noticed how much is actually stacked up over their heads. There is a temptation when this many things line up at once to reach for a darker explanation. I've already seen the theories starting to circulate online, the whispers that this is too neat, that someone is steering this, that a country does not just happen to face down the sky, the sun, and the ground on the exact anniversary of its founding without a hand on the scale somewhere. We are going to take that feeling seriously later, because it is a human feeling and it deserves an honest answer rather than a smirk. But I will tell you now where we're going to land, so you know I am playing straight with you. The truth is stranger and in some ways more unsettling than any conspiracy, because it does not require anyone to be in control at all. For now, hold on to the shape of it. 3 systems, 1 weekend, 1 grid, a birthday. And a country that is, for the most part, completely unaware that the sky above its cookouts is doing this much at once. I keep coming back to that word, ready, because it is the one that unlocks the whole thing. We are not unready in the sense that no one has warned us. Every piece of this is on an official government forecast right now, public, posted, free to read. The heat alerts are up, the storm watch is issued, the severe outlook is drawn. The asteroid has been tracked for years. In the narrow sense, the warnings could not be clearer. We are unready in a deeper sense, the sense that almost no one has put the pieces on the same table at the same time, and asked what it means that they are all arriving together. The heat is in the weather segment. The solar storm is in a niche corner of the internet. The earthquakes are a scroll-past headline. The asteroid is a fun fact. Each one lives in its own little box, watched by its own little audience, and the boxes almost never touch. This weekend, they touch. And the country that is about to walk out under all of it at once has, for the most part, no idea how much is actually stacked overhead. That is the strange gift of a date like this one. A birthday forces a reckoning. It makes us stop and look up all together on the same night, and this year when we look up we're going to be looking at more than fireworks, whether we know it or not. So I want to give you the thing the crowds will not have, which is the whole picture, assembled in order, with the connections drawn in and the coincidences labelled as coincidences. I want you to walk into this holiday as one of the few people who actually understands what is converging over your head, and why, so that when the aurora glows or the storms roll or the heat refuses to break, you are not frightened by it. You are oriented. You know what you are looking at. We are going to take these one at a time, and we are going to build them back into a single picture, because that is the only way any of it makes sense. We start with the biggest and the most dangerous, the one that is already sending people to hospitals as I speak, the one that turns the whole eastern half of the country into the floor of an oven for the length of a holiday weekend. We start with the dome. But before we walk underneath it, I want you to sit with one number, because it reframes everything that follows. Multiple National Weather Service offices, independent of one another, in different cities, have used the same phrase in their forecasts this week. Not daily record, not near record, all-time record. The Philadelphia office wrote that all-time record high temperatures could be challenged, with widespread triple digits. The New York office called the coming afternoon one of the hottest in recent memory. These are not excitable people. These are government meteorologists whose entire professional culture is built around not overstating things, and they are reaching, at the same time, for the strongest language they have. And I want to be clear about the through line before we start, because it is the difference between a scary list and an actual story. The spine of everything you're about to hear is not the heat by itself, or the storm by itself, or the thunderstorms by themselves. It is the way they all bear down on the same overtaxed nervous system of a modern country, the wires and the water and the cooling and the warnings at the same moment on the same night. The heat pushes on it. The sun pushes on it. The storms pull at it from the edges. And underneath, the slow warming of the sea makes the whole arrangement a little more likely to happen again next year and the year after that. Keep that spine in mind, because every section from here connects back to it, and by the end you will see that what looks like 4 or 5 separate emergencies is really one question wearing many faces. So the question that opens this whole story is a simple one, and I want you to carry it with you as we go. If the people whose job is to stay calm are all, at once, running out of calm words, what exactly is it that they can see coming that the rest of us cannot? What does it look like when a heat dome, a solar storm, and a severe outbreak all decide to keep the same appointment? And what happens to a country that has scheduled its largest celebration in half a century directly underneath the answer? Let us go find out, starting with the heat. Part 2. The dome. A heat dome is one of those phrases that gets used so often it has almost stopped meaning anything. So let me rebuild it for you from the ground up, because understanding the machine is the only way to understand why this particular one is so dangerous. Picture the atmosphere over the eastern United States right now as a room with a lid pressed down on top of it. That lid is a ridge of high pressure, an enormous mound of air sitting in the upper atmosphere, and the technical way forecasters measure its strength is by asking how high you have to climb before the air pressure drops to a certain level. This week, over the northeast, that level sits at what meteorologists call 594 decameters, and I know that number means nothing on its own, so here is the translation. It is a very strong ridge. It is the kind of ridge that shows up a handful of times a summer, not every week, and it is parked almost directly over the most densely populated corridor in the country. When a ridge like that sets up, it does 2 things at once, and both of them make heat. The first is that it acts as a lid, trapping the warm air underneath it, and blocking the cooler systems that would normally slide through and break the pattern. The second is subtler, and, in a way, more brutal. Under a strong ridge, air sinks, and when air sinks, it compresses, and when air compresses, it warms all on its own, without any help from the sun. This is not sunlight heating the ground. This is the atmosphere heating itself simply by pressing down on itself, so you get a double engine. The sun pours energy in from above onto ground that cannot shed it, and the sinking air adds its own warmth from within, and the lid keeps any relief from arriving. That is a heat dome, and that is what is sitting over the east right now. Now, let me give you the numbers the forecasters are actually seeing, because this is where the abstract becomes physical. About 5,000 feet up, at the level meteorologists watch, to gauge how hot the surface can get, the temperatures over the New York City region are flirting with 25 degrees Celsius. The forecaster in that office wrote a single phrase that stopped me cold. They wrote that this was about as high as has ever been recorded locally. Not this month, not this year. As high as the record. 5,000 feet up, the air itself is pressing against the ceiling of what has ever been measured there, and that warmth translates directly down to the streets, where the forecast calls for air temperatures in the low to mid-100s across the urban corridor of northeastern New Jersey, right around 100 in the New York metro, and the mid to upper 90s out toward Connecticut and Long Island. Move south, and it gets worse, not better. In the Philadelphia forecast office, the meteorologists wrote the words I mentioned a moment ago, and I want to read them to you carefully because the phrasing matters. They wrote that this is the type of pattern that could challenge all-time record high temperatures in the region, with widespread triple-digit readings today and tomorrow. They explained the mechanism too, and it is a cruel one. As the winds aloft shift, the air coming over the Appalachian Mountains sinks down the eastern slopes and warms by compression on the way, a process called downsloping, which is the same physics as the ridge itself but focused into a local fire hose of heat. That downsloping is why parts of the mid-Atlantic are forecast to hit between 100 and 105 degrees, with heat index values, the combination of heat and humidity that tells you what it actually feels like on your skin, climbing to between 105 and 110 and reaching as high as 115 where the humidity stays up. In the Baltimore and Washington forecast, the office described 850 hectopascal temperatures, that same 5,000-foot layer soaring to 24 and 25 degrees Celsius, and they laid out heat index values of 105 to 110 to the west of the Blue Ridge, and 110 to 115 to the east. And it was that office, the one covering the nation's capital, that took the step I keep coming back to. They issued an extreme heat watch for Independence Day itself, and in explaining why, they wrote about the high vulnerability around the Independence Day and, in their exact words, America's 250th celebrations. A government weather office, writing a technical forecast discussion, reached out and named the birthday because they understood that the calendar and the heat were about to collide. Go north to Boston, and the story does not soften. That office was looking at readings around 28 to 30 degrees Celsius at a slightly lower level of the atmosphere, which for them is extreme, and forecasting near-record high temperatures in the range of 97 to 103 degrees, with heat index values between 105 and 115. They flagged the same thing everyone else did, the thing that turns a hot afternoon into a genuine emergency, which we will get to in a moment. Even Chicago, out ahead of the core of the dome, was watching upper atmosphere heights climb toward that same towering level and forecasting heat index values around 100 to 105. Step back from the individual cities and look at the shape of the whole thing. The Weather Prediction Center, which writes the national forecast discussion, described a significant and dangerous heat wave running from the Ohio Valley into the east. They noted that their own heat risk product, the tool that rates how hazardous the heat is to human health, was sitting in the major to extreme category, the top of the scale, and would stay there into the holiday, lingering longest across the southeast. When the national forecasters and half a dozen local offices are all independently reaching for words like dangerous, extreme, and record, you're not looking at a normal summer hot spell. You're looking at something the professionals themselves consider exceptional. It is worth being precise about what makes this ridge exceptional rather than ordinary, because summer ridges come and go all the time. Meteorologists gauge how unusual a pattern is by measuring how far it departs from the long-term average for that time of year, and by that measure this ridge is running well above normal, the kind of amplitude that shows up a handful of times in a season rather than every week. But amplitude alone is not the whole story. Two other factors turn this from impressive into dangerous. The first is location. The core of the ridge is centered not over an empty stretch of desert or ocean, but over the Ohio Valley and the eastern population centers, which means the worst of the heat is landing on tens of millions of people rather than on open country. The second is persistence, the blocking pattern we discussed, which keeps the ridge parked in that populated position for days instead of letting it slide harmlessly through. A strong ridge over the wrong place that refuses to move, arriving on a holiday weekend. Change any one of those variables and this is a forgettable hot spell. Line all of them up and you get the event the forecasters are straining to describe. Let me put the alert numbers back in front of you, because now they should land differently. 256 active National Weather Service alerts, 59 of them extreme heat warnings, which the agency only issues when the heat is expected to be a serious threat to life, not merely uncomfortable. 55 heat advisories on top of that, 4 extreme heat. Watches for heat still on the way. Roughly 46% of every active weather alert in the entire country on this day is about heat. Not tornadoes, not floods, not winter storms. Heat. One single hazard, driven by one single ridge, is responsible for nearly half of everything the National Weather Service is warning about from coast to coast. And I want to head off a reasonable objection, because you might be thinking that a 100-degree day in July is not exactly a bulletin from another planet. You are right, a hot day in summer is normal. But that is not what this is. The tell is in 3 details that separate an ordinary hot spell from what is actually happening. The first is the all-time record language, appearing independently in multiple cities at once, which is rare. The second is the sheer geographic size of it, an alert footprint that covers the most populated third of the country simultaneously. And the third, the one we have not fully opened yet, is the nights. Because the thing that every one of these forecast offices flagged, the detail that turns this from a heatwave into a killer, is not how hot it gets in the afternoon. It is how little it cools down after dark. There is a reason this ridge is not simply passing through, and it is worth understanding because the duration is what turns a hot day into a lethal event. Normally weather moves. The jet stream, the fast river of air high in the atmosphere that steers our weather systems, usually keeps everything marching along from west to east, so a hot day is followed by a cooler one as the next system slides in. But sometimes the jet stream buckles into enormous stationary waves, great loops that stall and lock in place, and when that happens, a ridge can sit over the same region for days on end, refusing to move, blocking every cooler system that tries to approach. Forecasters call the pattern a block, and the shape it often takes, a great dome flanked by two troughs of low pressure, looks a little like the Greek letter omega, so you will sometimes hear it called an omega block. Whatever the name, the effect is the same. The weather stops moving, the lid stays shut, and the heat, instead of peaking for an afternoon and breaking, accumulates day after day after day. That accumulation is the real weapon. A single 100-degree afternoon is a nuisance. The same 100 degrees, repeated for 4 or 5 days, over ground and buildings and pavement that never get a chance to release the previous day's heat, becomes something else entirely. A slowly rising baseline where each morning starts warmer than the last. Cities are especially cruel in this respect, because concrete and asphalt soak up heat all day and radiate it back all night, an effect known as the urban heat island, which is exactly why the forecasters kept singling out the urban cores as the places where the overnight temperatures would refuse to fall. The dome does not just make a hot day, it makes a hot week that compounds, and compounding is the mechanism behind nearly every mass casualty heat event in the historical record. Sitting still also does something else that rarely makes the headlines but shows up in the alert count. When the air stops moving for days under a stagnant ridge, pollutants stop being flushed out. They pool. That is why, buried in those 256 alerts, there were 37 air quality alerts, a reminder that a heat dome does not only cook the air, it fouls it, trapping ozone and particulates near the ground where people breathe them, layering a respiratory hazard on top of the thermal one, and hitting hardest the same vulnerable lungs that the heat is already straining. I also want to give you a sense of just how unusual the language coming out of these offices really is, because it is easy to become numb to forecast adjectives. The National Weather Service runs a colour-coded tool called Heat Risk that rates the danger of a heat event to human health, from minor at the bottom to extreme at the top, and this week that tool was pegged in the major to extreme category, across a huge swath of the country, the top of the scale, the shade of red. The agency reserves for heat that threatens even healthy people, not just the vulnerable. And the phrase that keeps recurring, all-time record, is one meteorologists almost never reach for, because all-time means the hottest since records began at that location. In some cities, more than a century of daily measurements. Daily records fall all the time. All-time records are a different animal, and when two major city forecast offices independently warn that all-time records are in play in the same event, that is a meteorological signal flare, a sign that the professionals are looking at model output that genuinely unnerves them. Before we walk into that, sit with the mechanism one more time, because it is the spine of everything else in this story. A ridge of high pressure has locked itself over the east. It is trapping heat and generating more of it by compression. It is strong enough, and wide enough, and stubborn enough that the professionals are out of ordinary adjectives. And it is going to hold its grip through the holiday weekend, releasing its worst on the same days that tens of millions of people pour outdoors to celebrate. That ridge is not just a weather pattern. It is the reason the grid is about to strain. It is the reason the thunderstorms we will get to are exploding along its edges. And as we will see, it is even quietly connected to what the sun is doing, because both of them are about to lean on the same wires at the same time. But the ridge has one more secret to give up before we move on, and it is the one that actually hurts people. So let me ask you the question that the Boston and New York and Washington forecasters were all clearly worried about when they wrote their discussions this morning. When the temperature finally falls after a brutal afternoon, when the sun goes down and the crowds head home and the country tries to cool off and recover before doing it all again the next day, what happens if the night refuses to cooperate? What happens when the darkness itself stays hot? That is where the danger really lives, and it is where we go next. Part 3. The night that will not cool down. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. The afternoon high temperature is not what kills people in a heat wave. The night is. And once you understand why, you will never look at a summer forecast the same way again, because the number that actually matters is the one nobody puts on the graphic, the overnight low. Your body is, at its core, a furnace that never shuts off. Every minute you're alive, your cells are generating heat, and to stay at the temperature where your organs work, you have to shed that heat into the air around you as fast as you make it. During a brutal afternoon, that gets hard, but it is survivable, because you know relief is coming. When the sun goes down, the air normally cools, the ground releases the day's heat back into a clear sky, and your body finally gets a window to catch up, to unload the thermal debt it built up all day, to reset before it has to do it again. That nightly reset is not a luxury. It is the mechanism that keeps a multi-day heat wave from stacking up inside you. Now take that window away. That is what the forecasters were all warning about this morning, in office after office, because the same ridge that is trapping the afternoon heat is also trapping the night. The New York forecast called for overnight lows only falling back into the 70s and 80s, and it said in plain language that this would offer little relief overnight. The Boston office went further and warned that the urban core of the city might struggle to drop below 80 degrees at all, even in the dead of night. Think about that. A bedroom that does not fall below 80 degrees, night after night, in a city where a huge fraction of the older housing has no air conditioning at all. When the night stays hot, the reset never comes. Your core temperature, instead of dropping back to baseline by morning, starts each new day a little higher than the last. The heat debt compounds, night over night, and somewhere in that stack of unrecovered nights is the point where a healthy person becomes a heat illness statistic, and a vulnerable person becomes a fatality. This is the quiet physiology behind why heat waves are so deadly, and it is why the forecasters this week kept using a specific word that you do not usually associate with a sunny holiday. That word was deadly. The New York office wrote it directly. They said this level of heat can be deadly for those without adequate cooling and hydration, and then they added the line that I think everyone should hear at least once, because it reframes the whole hierarchy of things we fear. On average, they wrote, heat kills more people than any other weather-related hazard. Not tornadoes, not hurricanes, not floods or lightning or cold, heat. The slowest, quietest, least cinematic disaster on the list is also the one that fills the most graves, and it does it without a single dramatic image, one overheated body at a time, mostly indoors, mostly alone, mostly at night. We have talked on this channel over the past week about the science of exactly how heat crosses the line from uncomfortable to lethal, about the humid heat thresholds where sweat simply stops working because the air is already too saturated to accept any more moisture from your skin. I'm not going to walk all the way back through that physiology tonight, because the point right now is not the mechanism in isolation. The point is the calendar. The point is that this particular stretch of unrecoverable nights is scheduled to peak on the 2 or 3 days when the largest number of Americans in 50 years will be outside, at night, in crowds, for the anniversary. Let me make that collision concrete, because it is easy to say the words the 4th of July and picture something gentle. On a normal Independence Day, tens of millions of people gather outdoors in the evening. They stand on packed National Mall lawns and small-town baseball fields and city rooftops. They wait, often for hours, in dense crowds, for it to get dark enough for the fireworks. The very structure of the holiday requires people to be outside, standing still, packed together, into the night. Now overlay that on a forecast where the night itself does not cool below the upper 70s and 80s, where the heat index has spent the whole day between 110 and 115, and where the professionals are using the word deadly. You're asking the most heat-vulnerable behavior we do all year, standing in a stationary outdoor crowd after sunset, to happen during the exact window when the night has stopped offering relief. And this is the 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial, which means the crowds will not be normal-sized, They are expected to be the largest in a generation. More people, more events, more parades and concerts and gatherings, more elderly relatives brought along for a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, more small children kept out past their bedtime for a night nobody wanted them to miss. Every one of those descriptions, the elderly, the very young, the person who stayed out too long, the person who could not get to shade or water fast enough, is a line item in the medical literature on who dies in a heat wave. The holiday is, without meaning to be, a near-perfect recipe for heat exposure, and it is landing on the worst possible week for it. Then there is the infrastructure, which is where this part of the story quietly hands off to the next. The New York Forecast Office did not only warn about human bodies, it warned about the systems those bodies depend on. It listed impacts to transportation, specifically calling out rail, bridges, and tarmac. The steel and asphalt that expand and buckle and slow down in extreme heat. It listed impacts to water systems, noting how open hydrants during a heatwave can drop the pressure across a whole neighborhood. And it listed impacts to the electrical system, the one that everything else leans on, describing high electrical demand as a known consequence of heat events of this severity and duration. That last one is the thread I asked you to hold on to in the beginning, and now you can feel it starting to pull tight. A heat wave of this size does something very specific to the power grid. It drives demand toward the absolute ceiling. When every air conditioner in the eastern third of the country is running flat out, all day and crucially all night, because the nights will not cool, the grid carries a load close to the maximum it was ever built to handle. The wires run hot. The transformers run hot. The margin between what the system is delivering and what it physically can deliver shrinks to a sliver. On a normal hot day, the grid handles this. It is designed for summer peaks. But designed for is not the same as comfortable, and a grid running at its ceiling for days on end, through nights that never let it rest any more than they let your body rest, is a grid with very little slack left in it. Now remember what else is arriving this weekend. Remember that 93 million miles away, a storm is crossing the space between the sun and the earth, and that the government's forecasters expect it to arrive on the night of the 4th, and that the specific thing a geomagnetic storm does, the very specific thing, is to induce stray electrical currents in long power lines. Hold those two facts side by side. A grid pushed to its ceiling by record heat, and a solar storm arriving to nudge that same grid from the opposite direction, on the same night over the same country. Neither one, alone, is likely to break anything. That is the honest truth, and I will keep repeating it so you never think I am selling you a blackout. But the fact that both are going to be leaning on the same wires at the same time, on the biggest night of the year, is not a coincidence I am willing to walk past without stopping to look at it hard. There is a cruel arithmetic to a multi-day heat wave that I want to make explicit, because it is the thing people underestimate most. The danger does not rise in a straight line, it accelerates. The first hot day is uncomfortable but rarely deadly, because your body starts it rested. The second day begins with a body that never fully cooled overnight, so it climbs to a higher peak. By the third and fourth day, with each night failing to deliver the reset, the vulnerable are running a thermal deficit they cannot pay down, and that is the window when the emergency rooms fill and the medical examiners get busy. This is why the timing of this particular event is so unforgiving. The heat is not peaking on day one, when people are fresh and cautious. It is peaking on the third and fourth day, on the holiday itself, after several nights of no recovery have already quietly worn down the people least able to withstand it, at the exact moment those same people are being coaxed outdoors for the celebration. The dome has been softening its victims for days before the hardest blow lands, and it lands almost silently, which is the final cruelty. A hurricane announces itself. A tornado roars. Heat kills in perfect quiet, in still apartments and closed bedrooms, with no sound and no image, which is exactly why it slips past our attention even as it outpaces every other kind of weather in the body count. There will be no dramatic footage of this heatwave's worst moments, because its worst moments happen alone, indoors, in the dark, to people no camera is pointed at. That invisibility is not a reason to look away. It is the reason to look harder. Before we cross that 93 million miles to look at the sun, I want to leave you with the human picture, because it is the one that should stay with you longest. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic right now, in a third-floor apartment with no air conditioning, an older person is sitting through the hottest afternoon of the year and telling themselves they will be fine that they have lived through summers before. Tonight that apartment will not fall below the low 80s, tomorrow will be just as hot, and the night after that and by the weekend when the fireworks are booming over a crowd of millions. That person will have gone 3 or 4 days without the reset their body needs to survive. They are not on any forecast graphic. They are not a headline, but they are the reason the professionals wrote the word deadly this morning, and they are the reason this heatwave, and not the solar storm and not the tornadoes, is the true centre of this story. Let me be specific about who is actually at risk, because heat does not strike evenly, and knowing the pattern is the difference between an abstract warning and a useful one. The people who die in heat waves are overwhelmingly the old, the isolated, the poor, the chronically ill, and the ones who cannot escape the heat because of where they live or how they work. An older person whose body no longer regulates temperature as efficiently, living alone, perhaps with a heart or kidney condition that heat makes worse, in an apartment without air conditioning, checking on no one and checked on by no one, is the single most common profile in the grim statistics. Add to that the outdoor workers who cannot simply stop, the construction crews and delivery drivers and farm hands whose jobs do not pause for a heat index of 115. Add the very young, whose small bodies heat up faster than an adult's. Add anyone without the money to run an air conditioner around the clock, which for many families is a real and painful calculation even when they own one. Heat is a disaster that finds the cracks in a society and pours into them. And notice what almost every one of those survival stories depends on: electricity. The air conditioner that keeps the vulnerable apartment survivable is not a comfort in a heat wave like this one, it is life support, and it runs on the grid. The cooling centres that cities open, the libraries and community halls where people without air conditioning are urged to shelter, run on the grid. The hospitals filling with heat cases run on the grid. The refrigerators keeping medication viable run on the grid. In an ordinary disaster, losing power is an inconvenience. In a heat wave of this severity, losing power, even in a neighbourhood, even for hours, is the removal of the one thing standing between thousands of vulnerable people and a genuine medical emergency. This is why the grid strain we are building toward is not a technical footnote. In a heat event, the grid is not a convenience. It is the difference between a hot week and a body count. Now layer the holiday on top of that, because the celebration itself introduces its own set of risks that map almost perfectly onto the danger. People at a 4th of July gathering are doing all the things that make heat illness more likely, often without realizing it. They are standing outdoors for hours, frequently in direct sun during the day and in warm, still air after dark. They are drinking alcohol, which is a diuretic that quietly dehydrates the body while masking the early warning signs of heat exhaustion. They are travelling, sitting in hot cars, walking long distances from distant parking to packed viewing areas. They are, in many cases, bringing along the exact people most at risk: elderly parents and grandparents who did not want to miss a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, small children kept out well past their limits, and they are doing all of it in the largest numbers in half a century, drawn out by the significance of the anniversary. The holiday does not merely coincide with the heat. It actively recruits the most vulnerable people into the most dangerous conditions at the worst possible moment, and it does so in the name of joy, which is what makes it so easy to overlook. I do not say any of this to talk you out of celebrating. I say it because the single most effective thing in the world against a heatwave is not high technology. It is attention. It is someone checking on the older neighbour. It is carrying water and actually drinking it. It is knowing where the cooling centre is. It is recognising the early signs, the dizziness, the headache, the person who has stopped sweating and acting on them before they become an ambulance call. The forecasters can only issue the warning. Whether it saves anyone depends on whether the warning turns into a phone call, a knock on a door, a bottle of water pressed into someone's hand. The heat is the deadliest hazard of this weekend precisely because it is the one we are most likely to ignore. The heat is the backbone. Everything else in this video hangs off it. But the heat does not stop at the edge of the atmosphere, and to understand why this weekend is genuinely strange, and not just genuinely hot, we have to leave the ground entirely. We have to go to the surface of the sun, where two dark scars have been turning to face us, and where one of them has already fired the shot that is, right now, on its way here. Because the question that has been sitting under this whole section is about to get an answer from an unexpected direction. We have been asking what happens to a grid pushed to its limit by heat. Now we have to ask what happens when the sky above that grid decides to push back. Let us go to the Sun. Part 4. 93 million miles away. The grid that is about to strain under the weight of the heat has an enemy it cannot see, and that enemy is the Sun. Not the sunlight pouring down onto the pavement, which is bad enough. Something else. Something that left the Sun 2 days ago and is, at this very moment, closing the distance between there and here at more than 1 million miles an hour. To understand what is arriving on the night of the 4th, we have to leave the ground and travel 93 million miles, and we have to start with 2 dark marks on the face of our star. If you could look at the Sun safely today, and please never try without the right filter, you would see 2 large dark blemishes on its surface, one in the northern hemisphere and one in the south. Those are sunspots, and a sunspot is not a hole and not a cold dead patch, no matter how it looks. It is a place where the Sun's magnetic field has become so intensely concentrated that it chokes off the normal churning flow of heat from below, leaving that patch cooler and therefore darker than the blinding surface around it. A sunspot is, in other words, a knot. It is a place where the magnetic field has tied itself into a tangle so tight that the surface itself dimples under the tension. Most sunspots are simple. They have a clear magnetic north and a clear magnetic south, like an ordinary bar magnet, and they behave. But some sunspots become monsters, and the way scientists describe the most dangerous of them is with a specific piece of jargon that I want to translate for you because it is the key to this whole section. The classification is beta gamma delta. You do not need the Greek. Here is what it means in plain language. It means the magnetic field inside that spot has become so scrambled, with north and south poles jammed right up against each other inside a single dark core, that the field is under enormous unstable strain. And a magnetic field under enormous unstable strain does what any tightly wound spring eventually does. It snaps. Both of the large regions facing us this week are classified that way. Beta gamma delta, the most volatile configuration our Sun produces. One of them, the larger of the two, is enormous, covering an area of the solar surface measured in the thousands of millionths of the visible disk, with dozens of individual spots packed into its tangle. The forecasters have been watching both of them the way you would watch 2 downed power lines sparking on a wet street, knowing that at any moment either one could let go, and one of them already has. On the night of July 1st, one of these regions fired a solar flare, a sudden blinding release of magnetic energy, and it was a big one. On the scale scientists use to rank flares, it came in at what is called M8.5. That scale is strange because it is logarithmic, which means each letter is 10 times more powerful than the last, and the M class sits just 1 step below the X class, the most powerful category of all. An M8.5 flare is roughly 85% of the way from the bottom of the M range to the threshold of an X. In other words, it was very nearly the most powerful kind of flare the Sun can throw, and it fell just short. When it went off, it hurled a burst of X-rays across 93 million miles of space at the speed of light, and about 8 minutes later, when that light reached us, it ionized the upper atmosphere on the daylight side of the Earth and caused a radio blackout, degrading high-frequency communications for a stretch of time over the sunlit half of the planet. A flare is the flash, but a flash is not what threatens a power grid. The thing that threatens a power grid is the second act, the one that comes not at the speed of light, but at the speed of a thrown punch, and it is called a coronal mass ejection. When these tangled regions let go, they do not only emit a flash of radiation. Sometimes they also blow off a colossal cloud of their own atmosphere, billions of tons of electrically charged gas, threaded through with a piece of the Sun's own magnetic field, and they fling it out into space. If that cloud is aimed at the Earth, it becomes a slow-motion projectile taking 1 to 3 days to cross the gap, and it arrives not as light but as a physical wave of magnetized plasma slamming into the planet's magnetic shield. That is what is coming. A few days ago, on June 30th, in association with an even more powerful flare from this same restless neighbourhood of the Sun, a coronal mass ejection lifted off and turned toward Earth. It has been crossing the void ever since, and the government's Space Weather Prediction Centre, the official body that forecasts this kind of thing, has run the models on its speed and trajectory and issued a formal watch. they are predicting a geomagnetic storm rated G2, which is the moderate category on a 5-step scale, for both July 3rd and July 4th. Their best estimate for when the cloud actually strikes is the night of the 4th of July. Let me explain what happens when it hits, because this is where the sun reaches down and touches the same grid the heat is already straining. When that cloud of magnetized plasma slams into the Earth's magnetic field, it does not politely bounce off. It shakes the field violently, compressing it on the day side and stretching it out into a long tail on the night side, and then letting it snap back. And here is the piece of physics that matters for a power company. A changing magnetic field sweeping over the surface of the Earth induces electrical currents in anything long and conductive lying underneath it. Pipelines, railways, and above all the long high-voltage transmission lines that carry electricity across the continent. The storm essentially uses the entire power grid as an unintentional antenna, pushing slow, stray currents through wires that were never designed to carry them. Engineers call these geomagnetically induced currents, and in a strong enough storm they can saturate transformers, cause them to overheat, trip protective systems, and in the worst historical cases bring down parts of a grid entirely. I need to be scrupulously honest with you about scale here, because the whole credibility of this channel rests on not crying wolf. A G2 storm is moderate. It is not the kind of storm that has historically blacked out cities. The official impact statement for this specific watch says that at this level, power systems may experience minor fluctuations and that high-latitude systems, the ones far to the north, may see voltage irregularities. It is real, it is measurable, and on its own it would be a footnote, the kind of storm that happens several times a year and that most people never notice except as a pretty light show. If this were a normal week, I would tell you to go look north for the Aurora and not to worry about your lights, but it is not a normal week, and that is the entire point. This moderate storm is not arriving over a calm, well-rested grid with plenty of slack. It is arriving over a grid that has spent days pinned against its ceiling by the worst heatwave of the year, a grid whose transformers are already running hot, whose margins are already thin, whose operators are already working to keep supply ahead of a record air conditioning demand that will not even fall at night. You do not judge a nudge by how hard it is in a vacuum. You judge it by the state of the thing being nudged. A gentle push against a wall is nothing. The same gentle push against someone already standing on one foot at the edge of a step is a different event entirely. The storm is the push. The heat-strained grid is the person on one foot, and they meet on Saturday night. There is a strange grace to this collision too, and I would be cheating you if I only gave you the dread and left out the wonder. When that storm hits and shakes the magnetic field, it funnels charged particles down into the atmosphere near the poles, where they crash into oxygen and nitrogen and make them glow. And that glow is the Aurora, the northern lights. In a G2 storm, that glow gets pushed unusually far south. The official forecast says the Aurora could be visible as low as New York, Wisconsin, and Washington state. So picture it. On the night of the country's 250th birthday, at the very moment fireworks are bursting over the crowds, the sky itself may be lit from behind by a curtain of green and red that most of those people have never seen in their lives, produced by the same storm that is quietly leaning on the wires that make the fireworks broadcast possible. The beauty and the risk are the same event. They always are with the sun. And here is the part that should keep you watching. The reason I cannot tell you this story is over just because the storm is nearly here. The region that has fired so far is not even the worst of the two. The larger, more dangerous of the two dark tangles has not yet fired its biggest shot, and it is still turned toward us, still loaded, still classified in that most volatile beta-gamma-delta state, with the forecasters assigning it a real, non-trivial chance of producing an X-class flare, the top category, in the coming days. On top of that, a second coronal mass ejection, from another flare in the same neighbourhood, is already trailing the first one across space, and is expected to arrive a day or two behind it, around the 5th or 6th of July. In other words, the sun is not finished. The storm arriving on the 4th may be the opening act, not the finale. It is worth pausing on why the sun is this active in the first place, because it is not random. Our star runs on a roughly 11-year rhythm called the solar cycle, swinging from quiet years with a nearly blank face to stormy years crowded with spots and flares, and we are currently near the peak of one of those active phases. During these peaks, the sun's magnetic field is at its most tangled and its most productive, throwing off flares and coronal mass ejections far more often than during the quiet years. So the two dangerous regions facing us this week are not a freak occurrence. They are what an active sun does. The reason it matters for us is that our civilization built almost all of its most vulnerable technology, the satellites, the sprawling power grids, the global navigation systems during the modern era, and much of it has never been truly tested by the kind of storm the sun is fully capable of producing at the height of a cycle like this one. Let me also give you a clearer feel for the shield that stands between us and all of this, because without it none of us would be here to worry. The Earth is wrapped in a magnetic field, generated by the churning of molten iron in its core, and that field extends far out into space, forming a protective bubble called the magnetosphere. When the solar wind and these storm clouds come howling in, the magnetosphere deflects most of the danger, funneling the charged particles around the planet or down toward the poles. It is the reason life on the surface is not sterilized by radiation. But that shield is not rigid. A powerful storm compresses it, deforms it, and sets it ringing, and it is that ringing, that violent flexing of the field, that reaches down and induces the currents in our power lines. The Aurora and the grid risk are two symptoms of the same thing, the shield doing its job under a heavy blow. The flash of the flare, the part that travels at the speed of light, has its own set of effects worth naming because they are already happening. When that burst of X-rays hits the upper atmosphere on the daylight side of the Earth, it thickens the ionized layer that high-frequency radio waves normally bounce off of, and instead of bouncing, the signals get absorbed. The result is a radio blackout, and it is not theoretical. Airliners flying the polar routes, ships at sea, emergency and military communications, all of them rely on high-frequency radio, and during the strongest flares, those channels can fade out for tens of minutes at a time. The same storm that lights the sky and strains the grid can also, in its opening instant, reach down and mute a slice of the radio spectrum that a surprising amount of the world still depends on. And there are the satellites, thousands of them now, threaded through low orbit, carrying our communications, our imagery, our navigation. When a geomagnetic storm dumps its energy into the upper atmosphere, that atmosphere heats and swells, puffing outward like rising bread, and suddenly satellites that were skimming through near vacuum find themselves ploughing through thicker air, dragging, slowing, and drifting from their tracks. The navigation signals we all quietly depend on, the ones in every phone and every delivery truck and every aircraft, can degrade as the charged upper atmosphere distorts them. So this single storm, moderate as it is, reaches the ground and the sky and the orbital lanes all at once, which is exactly the kind of many-fronted event that our tightly wired world has quietly made itself vulnerable to. We told you about these sunspots as they were rotating into view, when forecasters had circled one of them and warned it was dangerous before it had done anything at all. That warning has now, in part, come true, and the storm it pointed to is the one crossing the last stretch of space toward us tonight. But a warning about the smaller region coming true is not the same as the larger one staying quiet. So the open question the sun leaves us with is genuinely open. We know the moderate storm is coming, and we know roughly what it will and will not do to a strained grid. What we do not know is whether the giant beside it will stay its hand through the holiday, or whether the sky over America's birthday has one more surprise still loaded and waiting. Hold that question, because we're about to bring the two halves of this story together. We have the heat pushing the grid up against its ceiling from below. We have the storm arriving to nudge it from above. It is time to stand exactly where those two forces meet, on the wires themselves, and ask what it actually means to stress one grid, two different ways, on the same night. That intersection is the true heart of this convergence, and it is where we go now. Part 5. Two kinds of strain on one grid. We have now built both halves of the machine, so let me set them next to each other, because this is the intersection that makes this weekend genuinely unusual rather than merely hot. On one side, a record heat wave is pushing the electrical grid up against its ceiling from below. On the other side, a geomagnetic storm is arriving to push that same grid from above. Same wires, same weekend, same country. This is the true centre of the whole story, and I want to walk through it slowly, because it is also the place where it would be easiest for me to lie to you, and I am not going to. Start with the heat, and picture the grid the way an engineer does, not as an abstraction, but as a physical thing with a temperature and a limit. On a searing afternoon, demand for electricity climbs as tens of millions of air conditioners kick on together. The wires carrying that current heat up, both from the electricity flowing through them and from the 100-degree air around them. Hot wires sag and lose efficiency. Transformers, the big humming boxes that step voltage up and down across the network, run hotter too, and heat is the enemy of a transformer because it degrades the insulation inside and shortens its life with every degree. On a normal summer peak, the system is engineered to handle all of this. Grid operators plan for July. But planning for a peak and running against that peak for days on end, through nights that never cool enough to let the equipment recover any more than they let your body recover, are two different things. By the holiday weekend, after days of record heat, the Eastern Grid will be a system with very little margin left, running hot, running full, with operators watching their reserves the way a pilot watches a fuel gauge on a long final approach. Now bring in the storm. When that cloud of solar plasma strikes the Earth's magnetic field on the night of the 4th and sets it shaking, that shaking field will sweep across the continent and, as we discussed, induce slow, stray electrical currents in exactly the longest conductors we have, the high-voltage transmission lines strung across the country. Those geomagnetically induced currents are direct current, and they flow into a system built for alternating current, and when they reach a transformer, they can push it into a state engineers call half-cycle saturation, where the transformer starts to overheat, hum louder, draw reactive power it should not, and in severe cases trip offline or suffer real physical damage. The grid in effect becomes a giant antenna for the storm, and the storm pours a kind of current into it that none of the equipment ever wanted. Here is why the combination is worth an entire section, even though neither piece alone would earn one. A transformer already running hot from days of record demand has less thermal headroom to absorb the extra heating from induced currents. A grid already operating with thin reserves has less slack to reroute power if a piece of equipment does trip. The two stresses are not just happening at the same time, they compound. The heat lowers the grid's tolerance for the storm, and the storm arrives at the exact moment that tolerance is lowest. It is the compounding, not either factor by itself, that makes this an intersection worth naming. And now, the honest part. The part that keeps this from being fear-mongering, because history has actually run this experiment for us at far higher intensities, and the results tell us exactly how seriously to take a moderate storm. Let me give you the real cases in order of severity so you can calibrate for yourself. The clearest warning shot in the historical record came in March of 1989. A powerful geomagnetic storm, far stronger than the one arriving this weekend, struck the Earth and induced currents that surged into the power grid of Quebec. In about 90 seconds, the entire provincial grid collapsed. 6 million people lost power, in some cases for around 9 hours, in the cold of a Canadian March. Transformers were damaged. It remains the textbook example of what a strong geomagnetic storm can do to a modern electrical network, and it is the reason grid operators take space weather seriously at all. But notice the word I keep using, strong. That storm was in a category well above the one forecast for this weekend. Come forward to May of 2024, to the storm that space weather scientists have taken to calling the Gannon storm, which was the most powerful to strike the Earth in more than 2 decades, rated at the very top of the scale. It lit up auroras over places that almost never see them, as far south as the tropics in some reports. It forced more than half of the satellites in low orbit to fire their thrusters and maneuver to avoid the thickening storm-swollen upper atmosphere. It caused irregularities and anxious hours for grid operators, and yet, notably, the lights largely stayed on. The grid, hardened by decades of lessons since 1989, absorbed even a top-of-scale storm without a Quebec-style collapse. That is genuinely reassuring, and I want you to hold it right next to the 1989 story, because together they bracket the truth. There is one more case, and it is the one that best captures why context is everything. In February of 2022, a company launched a batch of 49 small satellites into low orbit, and a geomagnetic storm struck that was only rated at the bottom of the scale, a G1 minor, the kind nobody would think twice about. But that minor storm warmed and puffed up the outer atmosphere just enough to increase the drag on those freshly launched satellites, and about 38 of the 49 were dragged back down and burned up in the atmosphere. A minor storm, the smallest category there is, destroyed most of a satellite fleet, not because it was powerful, but because it caught them in a vulnerable moment, right after launch, at low altitude before they could climb. Minor storm. Big consequence. Because timing and vulnerability, not raw strength, decided the outcome. That is the lesson I want you to carry out of this section, and it is the exact opposite of a doomsday warning. The storm arriving this weekend is moderate, and a modern hardened grid can almost certainly handle a moderate storm, even a heat-strained one. The Gannon storm tells us the grid is tougher than the 1989 nightmare suggests. But the Starlink satellites and the Quebec blackout both tell us the same deeper truth from opposite directions, which is that the consequence of a space weather event is never decided by the storm alone. It is decided by the state of the thing the storm hits. And this weekend, the thing the storm hits will be in an unusual state, pinned against its limits by record heat on the busiest night of the year. It helps to know that the people who run the grid are not passive in all this, because their response is part of why the likely outcome is a quiet one. Grid operators watch the same space weather forecasts we have been discussing, and when a storm watch is issued, they have real tools to reduce the risk. They can operate more conservatively, keeping extra generation ready in reserve. They can reduce the load on the most vulnerable transformers, reroute power to keep lines from running at their limits, and postpone any maintenance that would take equipment offline during the storm window. During the heat, they lean on what is called demand response, arrangements to trim electricity use at the peak, and on public appeals to conserve during the worst hours. In other words, the moderate storm arriving this weekend will not catch anyone by surprise. It has been forecast for days and the operators have a playbook. That preparation is exactly why I keep telling you the likely outcome is undramatic, and it is also, quietly, the best argument for funding the forecasting and the hardening in the first place, because the calm outcome is not luck. It is the product of warning plus preparation, the two things that turn a dangerous convergence into a non-event. None of that makes the intersection uninteresting, though, because the operators themselves would tell you that running a heat-maxed grid through a geomagnetic storm is not a routine Tuesday. It is a managed risk, and managed risk means there is a real, if small chance, the management is not enough, that a piece of equipment already stressed by days of record load meets the induced currents at the wrong moment and trips, and that a local outage cascades a little further than anyone wanted on the hottest, busiest night of the year. That chance is small, but it is not zero, and pretending it is zero would be its own kind of dishonesty. So what do I actually expect to happen? Almost certainly the honest answer is, not much that you will notice. The most likely outcome, by a wide margin, is that the grid holds, the Aurora is pretty, the fireworks go off, and the 250th birthday passes without a blackout, and this entire section becomes a story about a stress test that the country quietly passed. That is the boring, likely, good outcome, and I would put my money on it. But likely is not certain, and the reason this is worth your attention is not that I think the lights will fail. It is that we are, for one weekend, going to watch a modern nation lean on a single piece of infrastructure from two completely different directions at once, and in doing so we're going to see, more clearly than usual, just how much depends on that infrastructure, and how little slack we keep in it. That is a quietly unsettling thing to realise, and it has nothing to do with conspiracies or doom. It is simply the recognition that the entire structure of a modern holiday, the cold drinks, the air conditioning that keeps vulnerable people alive through the hot nights, the lights, the broadcasts, the hospitals ready for heat cases, all of it rests on a network of wires that we are about to stress two ways at once, and that we mostly never think about at all until the moment it is under load. The convergence does not have to break anything to teach us something. It only has to make us look. There is a bigger version of this lesson lurking behind the small one, and I would be doing you a disservice not to name it. The storm this weekend is moderate, but the same sun that produced it is capable of producing storms in the class of 1989, and worse. The truly extreme events, the ones scientists benchmark against a colossal storm from the 1850s that set telegraph lines sparking across two continents, are rare, but they are not impossible. One well-known estimate puts the odds of a storm that's severe at something like 12% in any given decade. 12% per decade is not a comfortable number for an event that could, at full strength, do to a continent-spanning grid what the 1989 storm did to Quebec. And a country that discovers, on an ordinary heat-stressed holiday weekend, how thin its margins already are against a moderate storm, might reasonably ask itself how ready it is for the rare one. This weekend is a drill. The question is whether anyone treats it like one. To really understand what a great storm can do, you have to go back to the one that scientists still measure all the others against, and it happened long before there was a grid to threaten. In the late summer of 1859, the Sun launched one of the most powerful coronal mass ejections in recorded history, and it struck an Earth that had almost no electrical technology at all, just the young telegraph networks strung between cities. The results were astonishing. Auroras blazed so far south that people saw them over the Caribbean, bright enough in places to read a newspaper by at night. And in the telegraph offices, the induced currents were so strong that the systems went haywire, sparks leaping from the equipment, operators shocked, some machines running on the storm's current alone after their batteries were disconnected. That event is now called the Carrington Storm, after the astronomer who watched the flare that caused it, and it is the benchmark for a worst-case space weather disaster. The sobering part is simple. If a storm like that struck today, it would not find a handful of telegraph wires. It would find a planet wrapped in continent-spanning power grids and a sky full of satellites, all of them acting as antennas. We have had smaller previews of that nightmare even in the last century. In the spring of 1921, another great storm struck and set railway signalling systems and telegraph equipment on fire in several countries, in what is sometimes called the Railroad Storm. And then came the Quebec collapse of 1989 that I described a moment ago, the clearest modern proof that a strong storm can take down a grid in seconds. String those together, 1859, 1921, 1989, and you see a pattern that should focus the mind. These events are rare, but they are not mythical. They recur, and each time one arrives, we are more wired, more interconnected, and more dependent on exactly the infrastructure they threaten. There is a specific vulnerability in the modern grid that deserves a sentence of its own, because it is the reason engineers lose sleep over the rare storms. The most critical pieces of the grid are the largest transformers, the enormous ones that step voltage up and down at major substations. They are the beating hearts of the network, and they have a terrible property from a resilience standpoint. They are custom built, they can take a year or more to manufacture, they are largely made overseas, and we do not keep many spares. A storm that damaged a number of them at once would not be a 9-hour outage like Quebec. It could be a months-long gap in some regions, because you cannot simply run to a warehouse for a replacement that takes 18 months to build. This is the real fear behind the extreme scenario, not that the lights flicker, but that a piece of irreplaceable hardware cooks itself and cannot be swapped out quickly. It is worth saying clearly that the moderate storm arriving this weekend poses essentially no risk of that, but it is the reason the whole subject matters, and the reason a heat-stressed near-miss is worth paying attention to. For now, though, come back down from that larger fear to the concrete weekend in front of us, because the grid is not the only place the heat dome is reaching out to touch. The same ridge that is pinning the grid against its ceiling, and that is quietly connected to the storm arriving from the sun, is also, along its far northern and western edges, tearing the sky open. While the east bakes in still heavy air, the middle of the country is about to be hammered by some of the most violent thunderstorms of the year, and they are not a separate story either. They are the dome's own doing. To see why, we have to walk out to the edge of the lid, to the place where the trapped heat finally finds a way to explode. We go there next. Part 6. The Ring of Fire. There is a phrase forecasters use for the band of violent storms that forms around the rim of a big summer heat dome, and it is a good one because it captures both the shape and the menace. They call it the Ring of Fire. Not the geological one, the circle of volcanoes around the Pacific, but a meteorological cousin, a ring of thunderstorms that ignites around the edge of the ridge like sparks thrown off the rim of a spinning wheel. And the single most important thing to understand about this ring is that it is not a separate weather system that happened to show up during the heat wave. It is the heat wave seen from its edge. The dome and the storms are the same machine. Let me show you why they are inseparable. In the center of the dome, under the heaviest part of the ridge, the air is sinking, and sinking air suppresses storms, which is why the core of the heat wave is hot, still and dry, a lid pressed flat. But a lid has edges. Out along the northern and western flank of the ridge, where the sinking air of the dome meets the flow of the jet stream and the moisture streaming north off the Gulf, the atmosphere is not suppressed. It is primed. The heat that the dome has been pouring into the lower atmosphere for days does not simply vanish at the edge. It becomes fuel. and along that rim the same energy that is baking the east gets converted into some of the most explosive thunderstorm potential of the entire year. Meteorologists actually measure that fuel, and the number they use is worth knowing because it tells you how loaded the atmosphere is. It is called convective available potential energy, and you can think of it as the amount of stored explosive energy waiting to be released if a storm can get started. The difference between a warm, buoyant parcel of air near the ground and the colder air above it that will let that parcel rocket upward. Values above about 2,500 are considered strongly unstable. Along the rim of this dome, the forecast soundings are showing values in excess of 4,000. That is an atmosphere with an enormous amount of coiled energy in it, a landscape of stored buoyancy just waiting for a trigger, and this week it is going to get one. The Storm Prediction Center, the national office that forecasts severe thunderstorms, has drawn its risk map accordingly, and it is a serious one. They have placed an enhanced risk, which is level 3 on their 5-step scale, across portions of the upper Midwest, with a broad slight risk fanning out from the Dakotas through the western Great Lakes and reaching all the way down across the southern Appalachians and the Tennessee Valley. When you see that footprint, you're looking at the outline of the dome itself traced in the language of severe weather. Every one of those risk areas sits on the ridge's edge. Now let me tell you what those storms are actually capable of, because the hazards are specific and they are nasty. In the Tennessee and Ohio valleys, the forecasters are especially worried about something called a wet microburst. Picture a thunderstorm that has sucked up an enormous load of water high into its core. When that water-heavy column can no longer be held aloft, it collapses, and it comes crashing down as a concentrated slug of rain-cooled air that hits the ground and blasts outward in every direction. Because the atmosphere there is so unstable, with steep temperature drops in the lowest couple of miles, those downbursts can hit the surface with winds of 60 to 70 miles an hour, the equivalent of a small hurricane compressed into a few minutes over a single town, capable of snapping trees and tearing off roofs with almost no warning. Farther northwest, across the upper Midwest, the threat shifts to the classic hardware of a plain summer. There the storms are expected to organize into supercells, the rotating, long-lived thunderstorms that produce the biggest hail and the most damaging winds, capable of dropping hailstones large enough to shatter windshields and strip siding. As the evening wears on and those storms merge, they can grow upscale into a single massive complex, a Boeing line of storms that races along for hundreds of miles, driving a continuous wall of damaging wind ahead of it, well into the overnight hours. The forecast office in Bismarck, North Dakota, put the threat in blunt terms in its hazardous weather outlook, warning of hail up to 2 inches across, wind gusts up to 80 miles an hour, and the line that always makes me sit up that a tornado cannot be ruled out. This is not a distant hypothetical for later in the week. It is already underway. At the time of the data, 6 separate severe thunderstorm watches were active across the country, the boxes the Storm Prediction Center draws when conditions are ripe for storms to turn dangerous, and the outlook carried the threat forward, keeping a slight risk in play for the following day and nudging it eastward toward the mid-Atlantic, right toward the same populated corridor already suffering under the heat. The dome bakes the cities by day, and its own edge sends storms marching toward them by night. I want to give you one more image of the wind threat because it is the one most likely to matter to a crowd. A wet microburst is, in a sense, the most democratic of severe weather hazards, because it does not need a tornado's rotation or a supercell's organization to hurt you. It just needs a storm heavy with rain over an unstable atmosphere, and this week the atmosphere is as unstable as it gets. When that downdraft slams to the ground and fans out, it can produce a sudden roaring wall of wind out of a sky that, minutes earlier, looked like nothing more than an ordinary summer storm. For an outdoor gathering, a stage, a tent, a fireworks setup, a crowd with nowhere to shelter, that sudden blast is the real danger, more than the lightning people fear and far more than the rain. It arrives with little warning, from a storm that did not look special, which is exactly what makes it dangerous during a weekend when so many people will be standing in open fields waiting for dark. And there is a second face to this violence, one that seems like the opposite of the storms but comes from the same source, and that is water. The very same setup that lifts Gulf moisture along the ridge's rim and detonates it into thunderstorms also, where the storms move slowly or train one after another over the same ground, dump staggering amounts of rain. Overnight, parts of southeastern Minnesota received between 5 and 8 inches of rain, enough to trigger a flash flood warning near the Iowa border and to send water pouring over roads. River flooding was already unfolding across the region, on the Kickapoo in Wisconsin, on the Pearl along the Louisiana and Mississippi line, and on the Patoka in Indiana, where the forecast crest was climbing toward the highest level ever recorded there. So the Ring of Fire is not only wind and hail, it is also flood. Fire and water, drawn from the same overheated engine, ringing the dome on every side. I want to connect this back to the human weekend, because it is easy to talk about severe weather as an abstraction on a map, and this one has a very specific collision course with the holiday. The middle of the country, the same region threaded with these storm risks, is also going to be full of people on the 4th, at parades and cookouts and fireworks displays of its own. A severe thunderstorm does not check the calendar. An 80-mile-an-hour gust does not pause for a fireworks show. Outdoor events across the storm zone will be making the same nervous calculations that outdoor events always make when the sky turns green on a summer evening, except this year it is happening during the largest set of outdoor gatherings in 50 years, over the same days, driven by the same ridge that is cooking the coasts. The heat threatens the crowds in the east by refusing to cool down. The storms threaten the crowds in the middle of the country by blowing up out of the dome's own edge. 2 hazards, 1 ridge, 1 holiday. We've watched this exact pattern assemble over the past several days, and I told you when we last looked at it that the Ring of Fire was closing around the country and that this blocking setup was not going to break quickly. It has not broken. It has matured. The heat has intensified. The records have come into reach. The storms along the rim have organised, and now the whole thing is bearing down on the holiday weekend with the added twist of a storm from the sun arriving in the middle of it. The pattern we were tracking is no longer a forecast. It is the ground we are standing on. Let me add a little more about why some of these storms turn into the truly dangerous kind, because the ingredient that separates a passing thunderstorm from a tornado-producing supercell is one you cannot see, and it is called wind shear. Shear is the change in wind speed and direction as you climb through the atmosphere, and when the winds near the ground blow one way, while the winds a few miles up blow faster and from a different angle, that difference gets rolled into a storm and sets its whole updraft rotating. A rotating thunderstorm, a supercell, is a fundamentally more organised and more dangerous machine than an ordinary storm capable of sustaining itself for hours, growing hail to enormous sizes by carrying ice up and down through the freezing levels again and again, and, when the rotation reaches the ground, spinning up a tornado. Across the upper Midwest this week, the combination of that huge reservoir of instability and enough shear to organise it is why the forecasters used the word supercell, and why an office in North Dakota was willing to write that a tornado could not be ruled out. The flooding side of the ledger comes from a different but related trick of the atmosphere, and it has a name too. When storms form along a slow-moving boundary and then travel along it one after another, each new storm passing over the same ground the last one just soaked, forecasters call it training, like rail cars running over the same stretch of track. Training storms are how a region gets 5, 8, 10 inches of rain in a single night, far faster than the ground can absorb it, and they are why the flash flood warnings were already going up across the upper Midwest, even as the heat and the severe threat dominated the headlines. The Patoka River in Indiana was climbing toward the highest crest ever recorded there, a reminder that the same overheated pattern generating the wind and the hail was also on its wetter flank staging a genuine flood. There is one more form these storms can take, and it is the one most likely to intersect with the holiday itself. When a cluster of thunderstorms organises into a single, long-lived complex and races along for hundreds of miles, driving a continuous wall of damaging straight-line wind ahead of it, that event has a name, a derecho, and it can do hurricane-force damage across an enormous corridor in a matter of hours, often at night. The overnight timing is not a small detail during a holiday weekend, because a wall of 80-mile-an-hour wind arriving after dark over a region full of people camped out for fireworks or asleep in the path of a storm they never saw coming, is a genuinely dangerous scenario, and it is exactly the kind of event the ingredients this week can produce. The heat threatens the east by refusing to cool. The storms threaten the middle of the country by exploding out of the dome's edge, and the same lightning that makes a fireworks show feel small can start fires and kill people who thought the real danger was the fireworks. So let me leave this section where it belongs, back on the central thread, because the storms are not a detour from the story, they are a proof of it. The lesson of the Ring of Fire is that the heat dome is not a single hazard, but a hazard factory, generating record heat in its centre, violent wind and hail along one edge, flooding rain along another, and doing all of it from one connected pattern. When you understand that, the whole weekend stops looking like a run of bad luck, 3 or 4 unrelated disasters that happen to pile up on the same date, and starts looking like what it is, a single overheated system expressing itself in every direction at once. The heat, the storms, the strain on the grid, they all trace back to the same ridge and the same overheated lower atmosphere. But there are pieces of this weekend that the ridge cannot explain, threads that come from much farther away and much deeper down, and to be honest with you about everything converging over the country, I have to account for them too. There is a mountain of rock that will pass the Earth on the 4th itself. There is the ground beneath us, which has been strangely busy. And there is the slow, vast warming of an ocean that may be the reason weekends like this are becoming more likely in the first place. None of those are caused by the dome, but all of them are arriving in the same window, and together they complete the picture of just how much the sky and the Earth are doing over this one holiday. Let us take them in turn. Part 7. Everything else. The sky is doing. If the story ended with heat, storm, and grid, it would already be a strange enough weekend. But when I sat with the full sweep of the data, I kept finding more things arriving in the same window, things the heat dome cannot explain because they come from much farther away and much deeper down, and I would not be telling you the whole truth if I left them out. None of what follows is a crisis. All of it is texture. And together, that texture is the thing that tips this weekend from unusual into genuinely uncanny, because it is not just the weather that is busy over America right now, it is nearly everything. Start above the atmosphere, past the storms and the Aurora, out where the rocks are. On the 4th of July itself, a catalogued asteroid, an object large enough that astronomers have been tracking it for years, is going to pass the Earth. It is not small. Its brightness implies a body somewhere in the range of a quarter mile to half a mile across, the kind of object that, if it ever did strike, would be a civilization-scale event. And it is threading past on the holiday, closing to a little over 9 times the distance between the Earth and the Moon, moving at nearly 17 kilometers every second. Now let me be completely clear, because on this channel we do not manufacture fear from safe distances. 9 lunar distances is a clean, wide miss. This asteroid is not a threat to anyone. It will pass, and the Earth will not so much as feel it. But the timing is the point. On the exact day the country marks its 250th year, a mountain of rock will slip by in the dark overhead, unseen by the crowds below, one more object keeping the same strange appointment as everything else. 3 smaller asteroids follow it across the next several days, all of them safe, none closer than several times the distance to the Moon. The sky is busy this week even where it is harmless. Come back down, all the way down, past the crowds and through the ground under their feet, because the Earth itself has been restless. In the 7 days leading up to this holiday, the planet logged more than 100 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater, which is on the higher side of a normal week but not alarming on its own. What catches the eye is not the count but the character. The largest was a magnitude 6 event off the coast of eastern Japan, deep enough and far enough offshore that it did no damage and raised no tsunami, but a solid, respectable jolt all the same. Off the coast of the Philippines, near Luzon, a genuine swarm was underway, a tight cluster of quakes in the high 4s firing one after another in the same spot over the course of a single day, the signature of a fault actively rearranging itself. And in the far South Atlantic, around the remote South Sandwich Islands, another swarm was shaking loose, a string of magnitude 5 events. The ground is not connected to the heat dome in any way. It is doing its own thing, on its own schedule, driven by forces that have nothing to do with the sun or the ridge. But it is doing that thing this week, alongside everything else. And when you're already holding a heat wave and a solar storm and a severe outbreak in your head, a restless planet underneath it all only deepens the sense that the whole system is somehow leaning forward at once. I want to resist a temptation here, out loud, because you may be feeling it too. It is tempting when the sun is flaring and the ground is shaking in the same week, to draw a line between them, to imagine that the solar storm is somehow rattling the planet's faults. It is a natural thought, and we have taken it seriously before, and the answer has not changed. The energy budget does not work. The forces a solar storm brings to bear on the Earth's crust are orders of magnitude too small to trigger an earthquake, and there is no reliable statistical link between the two, no matter how neatly they sometimes line up on a calendar. The assessment does not shake the ground. The two are keeping the same appointment, but they did not plan it together, and that distinction between things that happen at the same time and things that cause each other is going to become the whole point of where this video is heading. There is one more thread, and it is the slowest and quietest of all, and it may be the most important. Underneath this entire hot, violent summer, the Pacific Ocean is warming. The measurement scientists used to track it, an index of the sea surface temperature in a key stretch of the equatorial Pacific, has climbed to plus 0.48, up from clearly negative values just months ago, and it is still trending upward, with the ocean there sitting around 28 degrees Celsius. That reading is still officially in neutral territory, not yet a full El Niño, but the direction is unmistakable, and the direction matters, because a warmer Pacific loads the dice for exactly this kind of summer. It feeds more heat and more moisture into the atmosphere, it tilts the odds towards stronger heat waves and more explosive storm setups, and it does so not for one weekend but for seasons at a stretch. The ocean is the long, slow hand on the scale beneath the fast-moving drama of the holiday, and it is pushing gently but steadily toward a world where convergences like this one are less and less a coincidence. Even the fire risk fits the pattern, because a heat dome does not only bake, it also dries. Along the dome's western and northern flanks, where the air is hot and the humidity has been wrung out, more than 1,500 active fire hotspots were burning across the country, with a red flag warning posted for parts of Colorado, where the humidity had dropped as low as 6%, and a fire weather watch raised in the Pacific Northwest. The same ridge that is drowning the east in humid heat is parching the interior west into a tinderbox. It is the same machine, once again showing a different face, this time made of dry wind and low humidity and the threat of flame. I want to hold on to that distinction between things that happen together and things that cause each other, because it is about to become the heart of where this video ends. All week I've been careful to tell you which of these threads are truly linked and which are merely simultaneous, and that care is not pedantry. It is the whole difference between understanding the sky and being ruled by fear of it. The heat and the storms share a cause, and I can draw you the line between them on a map. The asteroid and the earthquakes and the warming ocean do not share a cause with the heat or with each other. They are separate machines, running on separate clocks, that happen to have their gears turning at the same moment we chose to look. And yet, laid out together like this, they produce something that feels almost unbearably meaningful, a sense that the world itself is converging on a single date, leaning in, holding its breath. That feeling is real, and it is powerful, and in the final part of this story we're going to take it apart honestly, because it is the most human response of all to a week like this one, and it deserves a real answer rather than either a shrug or a scare. So step back and look at the full board on the eve of the 4th. A record heat dome over the east, a geomagnetic storm inbound from the sun, a severe weather outbreak firing along the dome's edge, a half-mile mountain of rock threading past overhead, a planet logging quakes and swarms from Japan to the South Atlantic, an ocean warming quietly underneath all of it, fires smouldering along the dry western rim. Not all of it is connected, and I have been careful to tell you which threads tie together and which ones do not. The heat and the storms and the fires and the grid strain are one machine. The asteroid and the earthquakes and the warming ocean are their own separate stories. But every single one of them is arriving in the same narrow window, over the same country, on the same symbolic weekend. And that is a genuinely remarkable thing to be able to say. And it raises the question that this entire video has been walking toward from the very first minute. Because when this much lines up at once, the human mind does something predictable and powerful. It starts looking for a reason. It starts asking whether all of this can really just be chance, whether a country truly faces down the sky, the sun, the storms, and the ground on the exact anniversary of its birth without some hand on the scale somewhere. That question deserves a real answer, not a dismissal, and the answer turns out to be stranger and more unsettling than any theory of control. So let us go there now, to the last and largest question of all, the one hiding underneath the word converging in the title. Is anyone steering this? And if not, what does it mean that no one is? That is where we finish. Part 8. No one is ready. So let us finally ask the question that has been sitting under this entire video, the one you may have been feeling since the first minute even if you didn't say it out loud. When a heat wave, a solar storm, a severe outbreak, a passing asteroid, and a restless planet all keep the same appointment on the exact anniversary of a nation's founding, is someone steering this? Is it possible that this is too neat to be chance? I promised you at the start that I would take that question seriously rather than laugh it off, and I meant it, because it is one of the most human questions there is, and the honest answer teaches you more than the dismissal ever could. Here is the first thing to understand, and it is about your own mind, not about the sky. The human brain is a pattern-finding machine that was built over millions of years to see intention everywhere, because for our ancestors the cost of missing a real pattern was death, and the cost of imagining a false one was almost nothing. If the grass rustled, the person who assumed a predator and ran lived more often than the person who assumed the wind. So we inherited a brain that reaches instinctively for agency, for a who, for a hand on the scale, whenever events line up. Scientists even have a name for the specific version of this where we see meaningful patterns in random noise, and nothing supercharges that instinct like a symbolic date. Put a string of unrelated events on an ordinary Tuesday and no one blinks. Put the very same events on the 4th of July, on the 250th birthday, and suddenly they feel authored, as if the timing must mean something, because our minds simply refuse to accept that something this loaded could also be this random. Now let me separate as cleanly as I can what is really connected from what only feels connected, because this is the crux of the whole story. Some of these threads genuinely are linked, and I have shown you the mechanism every time. The heat, the severe storms, the flooding, the fire risk, the strain on the grid. Those are one machine, all of them radiating from the same ridge of high pressure, and their connection is not a theory, it is physics you can trace on a map. But the other threads, the solar storm, the passing asteroid, the earthquakes half a world away, those are genuinely independent. The sun did not flare because it is America's birthday. The asteroid has been on its orbit for longer than there has been a country to have a birthday. The faults off Japan and in the South Atlantic do not know or care what the calendar says. These things are arriving together, but they are not arriving together on purpose. And the difference between those two statements is the difference between understanding the world and being frightened by it. So could someone be engineering it? I want to answer this plainly because it matters. There is a persistent idea that events like these can be manufactured, that a heat dome can be built or a storm steered by some hidden facility with its hand on the weather. And when you actually run the numbers, that idea collapses, not because scientists say so from authority, but because of simple bookkeeping. The energy in a ridge of high pressure the size of the eastern United States is staggering, comparable to the output of the entire human race many times over. No facility on Earth commands a fraction of the energy it would take to build one, hold it in place for a week, and dissolve it on schedule, and no one steers a coronal mass ejection, a billion-ton cloud launched by the sun from 93 million miles away, days before it arrives. The scale is simply beyond us. The honest conclusion is not that someone is doing this, it is that no one is. And I would gently suggest that this is the more unsettling answer, not the more comforting one. Think about why. A conspiracy, as dark as it sounds, is actually a strangely reassuring story, because it means someone is in control. It means there is a hand on the wheel, a plan, an intelligence that could, in principle, be reasoned with or stopped. The truth is lonelier than that. The truth is that the heat and the storm and the asteroid and the quakes all converged on this one weekend for no reason at all, because the universe is enormous and busy and indifferent, and every single day it is doing this much and more over our heads and under our feet. We just do not usually add it all up. Most days the heat is in one report and the space weather is in another and the earthquakes are in a third, and no one ever lays them side by side. This weekend, because of the date, we finally did. And what we found was not a plot. It was the ordinary, staggering, unremarked-upon activity of a living planet under a violent star, laid bare for once because the calendar forced us to look. That is what the title really means. No one is ready for what is converging over America this 4th of July, and the reason no one is ready is not that a catastrophe is certain. It is that we almost never look at the whole board at once. We are not ready in the sense that we have not reckoned with how many independent systems we are holding in our hands at any given moment, how thin the margins are between them, and how much of our comfort and our safety rests on infrastructure we never think about until the night is under strain from two directions. The convergence did not have to break anything to be a warning. It only had to make us look, and looking is the thing we are least prepared for. Because look at what the looking reveals. It reveals a grid that a modern nation utterly depends on, and that we're about to stress two ways at once, and that has far less slack in it than most people assume. It reveals that the deadliest hazard of the weekend is not the dramatic one, not the storm from the sun or the tornado on the plains, but the slow, quiet heat that kills more people than any other kind of weather, and does it mostly out of sight, in hot rooms, at night, one vulnerable person at a time. And it reveals, underneath all of it, an ocean-warming season over season, tilting the odds so that the kind of overloaded, everything-at-once weekend we're about to live through becomes less and less of a fluke and more of a forecast. This convergence is a coincidence. The next one may not be. And the one after that may not need a symbolic date to feel authored, because it will simply be what summer has become. Let me say plainly what being ready would even look like, because the title says no one is ready. And that is an accusation that deserves a definition rather than just a mood. Being ready, at the smallest scale, is the bottle of water you actually drink, the older neighbour you actually check on, the cooling centre you actually know the location of before you need it. It is looking up the storm risk before you drive 2 states away for the fireworks, and knowing where you would shelter if the sky turned. Being ready at the larger scale is a country that funds the satellites and the forecasters who gave us days of warning about this storm, that stockpiles the giant transformers it cannot quickly replace, that hardens its grid against induced currents the way the smart operators already have, that builds the boring, unglamorous resilience that turns a Carrington-scale threat into a survivable inconvenience. None of that is exotic. All of it is known. The gap is not knowledge. The gap is attention and will. And both of those tend to arrive only after a disaster, which is precisely the trap, because the whole point of a near miss is that it is the one chance to act before the disaster rather than after. And here is the paradox that sits at the very centre of it, the thing I most want you to carry out of this. The more capable we become, the more exposed we become, because every new capability is one more thread strung between us and a sky that does not care about us at all. 250 years ago, a bad solar storm would have singed some telegraph wires that did not yet exist and otherwise passed unnoticed over a country of farms. Today, the same storm finds a nervous system of wires and satellites and forecasts wrapping the entire continent. And the very sophistication that makes us powerful is the same sophistication that makes us vulnerable. We did not make a mistake building all of this. It is a wonder, but a wonder we refuse to look at clearly as a wonder that can hurt us, and the looking is the part we keep putting off. I told you I would not sell you a blackout, and I will keep that promise all the way to the end. The most likely outcome of this weekend by far is that the country gets through it. The grid holds. The Aurora, if it comes, is beautiful. The fireworks go off over the crowds, and the storm from the sun becomes a story about a stress test that a hardened, resilient system quietly passed. That is the probable ending, and it is a good one, and I hope with everything in me that it is the one we get. But probable is not certain, and even the good ending carries the lesson, because a nation that discovers on an ordinary heat-stressed holiday how little margin it keeps against even a moderate storm should be asking itself, calmly and seriously, how ready it is for the rare and monstrous one that the same sun is fully capable of sending. This weekend is a drill. The only failure would be to survive it and learn nothing. I keep calling it a mirror, and I want to say exactly what I mean by that, because it is the whole reason this weekend is worth your attention, even in the very likely case that nothing breaks. A mirror does not threaten you. It shows you something you already are but do not usually see. And what this convergence shows us is a civilization that has quietly wired itself into the sky. We draw our power through lines the sun can reach out and touch across 93 million miles. We keep our most vulnerable people alive with machines that run on a grid we push to its ceiling every single summer. We hang our communication and our navigation on satellites that swim through an atmosphere a solar storm can inflate. We have built something magnificent and intricate and in ways we rarely acknowledge exposed, and most days the exposure stays invisible because the sky stays quiet. This weekend the sky is not quiet and the mirror is uncovered, and for once we can see the wiring behind the wall. 250 years ago, a group of people put their names to a document in the summer heat of another July, in a world lit by candles and powered by muscle and wind and water. They could not have imagined the machine their descendants would build on top of what they started, or the way that machine would one day be plugged directly into the weather and the sun. They built a country. We built a civilization on top of it that is more powerful and more capable than anything in human history, and also more dependent on a handful of systems that almost no one thinks about until the night those systems are under strain. The founders worried about tyranny, about the hand of a distant king. We have to worry about something they never could have pictured, the hand of a distant star, and the quiet fragility of the web we have strung between ourselves and the sky. That is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for exactly the kind of clear-eyed attention this holiday, of all holidays, ought to invite. And the sun, remember, may not be finished. The larger of the two dark regions, the more dangerous one, the one wound into that most volatile magnetic state, has not yet fired its biggest shot, and it is still turned toward us, still loaded, rotating slowly into the position from which its next blast would be aimed most directly at Earth. A second cloud is already trailing the first across space. The storm arriving on the fourth may be the opening act and not the finale, and if the giant lets go while it is still facing us, the moderate story we have been telling could become a different story very quickly. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because it is true, and because it is the thread I will be watching after the last firework fades and the crowds go home and the country, tired and hot and mostly unaware of everything that passed over it, turns the page on its 250th birthday. 250 years ago, a group of people signed their names to a document under the summer heat of another July, and they could not possibly have imagined the machinery their descendants would come to depend on, the wires and the transformers and the satellites and the forecasts, or the way the sun and the sky and the sea would one day all be measured and watched and laid side by side on a single screen. They built a country. We built a civilization on top of it that is wired into the sky in ways they never dreamed, drawing its power through lines the sun can reach out and touch, cooling its most vulnerable citizens with machines that run on a grid we push to its ceiling every summer, celebrating under a sky we have finally learned to read but not yet learned to respect. The convergence over America this weekend is not an attack, and it is not a plan. It is a mirror. And what it shows us, if we are willing to look, is a nation standing outside on its birthday, faces turned up to the fireworks, entirely unaware of how much is happening in the darkness just behind them, and how little it would take, on some future weekend not so different from this one, for the show in the sky to stop being something we watch, and start being something that watches back. I want to sit a moment longer with why the feeling of design is so hard to shake, because naming it is how you disarm it. Our ancestors who survived to become us were the ones who assumed the rustle in the grass had a cause and a will behind it, and so we inherited minds that are almost incapable of accepting pure coincidence. Especially when the stakes feel high and the timing feels meaningful, a symbolic date is like rocket fuel for that instinct. The same string of events on a forgettable Wednesday would read as noise, but drop them on the 250th 4th of July and every part of you insists that it must mean something, that the universe would not be so on the nose by accident. But the universe has no sense of occasion. It does not know it is a birthday. The sun flared on its own 11-year schedule. The ridge built on the physics of a buckled jet stream. The asteroid has kept its orbit since before humans wrote anything down. The meaning we feel is real, but it lives in us, not in the sky. We are the ones who drew the circle around this weekend and called it significant. The events just showed up. And I keep returning to the strange comfort buried in the darker story, because I think it explains why conspiracy theories are so seductive in moments exactly like this one. If someone is engineering the heat and steering the storms, then the world, however sinister, is at least under control. There is a plan. There is a hand on the wheel that could, in principle, be caught and stopped. The truth we actually live in is harder to hold, because it offers no such comfort. No one is driving. The convergence is not the work of a hidden power. It is the ordinary output of an enormous indifferent system that is always doing this much, every single day, over our heads and under our feet, in 100 channels we never bother to watch at once. The theory of control is a security blanket. The reality is a cold and open sky, and I understand completely why so many people reach for the blanket. It just does not happen to be true. There is a harder edge to this, and I would be letting you down if I softened it, which is that the reason these convergences are worth watching is that they are becoming more likely, not less. The slow warming of the oceans and the atmosphere is loading the dice, tilting the odds towards stronger heat domes, more explosive storm setups, and longer, more stubborn blocking patterns of exactly the kind stalled over the country right now. The sun runs on its own clock, indifferent to us, and it will keep sending storms at the height of every cycle, whether we are ready or not. What changes is the target. Every year we wire ourselves a little more tightly into the sky, hang a few thousand more satellites overhead, lean a little harder on a grid we keep pushing closer to its ceiling. So the coincidence stacking up over this particular holiday is, in a sense, a rehearsal. This time the pieces landed together by chance, but the individual pieces are each growing more common, and a day is coming when they will pile up, not because the calendar made them feel meaningful, but simply because there are so many of them in play at once that overlap stops being remarkable and starts being routine. The good news, and there is real good news, is that almost none of this is beyond our power to prepare for, and preparation is the one thing that turns a frightening story into a manageable one. Grids can be hardened against induced currents, and some already have been, which is precisely why the storm of 2024 did not become a second Quebec. Spare transformers can be stockpiled. Space weather forecasting, which gave us days of warning about the storm arriving this weekend, can be funded and improved so the warning comes earlier and sharper. Cities can open cooling centres, harden their most vulnerable housing, and build the simple human networks that check on the isolated when the nights stop cooling. None of it requires believing in a catastrophe. All of it requires believing the near misses when they come, and treating a weekend like this one not as a scare that passed but as a drill we were lucky enough to run in advance. The country that learns from an easy convergence is the country that survives a hard one. So enjoy the 4th, truly. Stand in the crowd, feel the heat, watch the colours, and hold your people close. But maybe, for just one moment between the fireworks, look a little past them, up into the dark where the Aurora might be glowing and the asteroid is slipping by and the storm is coming in, and understand that the sky over your celebration is doing more than you were ever told. Because the real question this weekend leaves us with is not whether we survive it. We almost certainly will. The real question is the one we will have to answer long after the smoke clears. Now that we have finally seen how much converges over us at once, and how thin the margins really are, what are we going to do about the fact that no one, anywhere, is ready? And how many more of these weekends do we get to survive on luck before one of them decides to collect?